Hey Outlier, my name's Shawn. I'm an investigative journalist based in Beirut and creator of CodeTheNews.com. I'm interested in long-form storytelling using data and mixed media to inform and connect people. And that's why I'm really honored to be among the speakers at Outlier Conference this year. When I look at the list of speakers at Outlier this year, I'm both inspired and a little intimidated by how much experience everyone has in a wide range of fields. For me, as a journalist, I work alongside people who have a lot of different skill sets, reporters, editors, photographers, and what I want to talk about today is how do we capture the potential of working together? I see journalism today producing cutting-edge work, some of the best out there, period. Deep data dives, visual investigations, and scientific explainers have really replaced the front page news as the premier site of storytelling in the public interest. And that, I think, is because of collaboration. I'm sure everyone watching this knows about the power of using facts to move people and cares about communicating ideas in a way that impacts people. We use data because truth is our instrument to change minds, to inform people, and maybe make one small part of the world slightly less unfair. When the pandemic started, I was like a lot of people, spending a lot of time indoors, and I decided after many years of waffling to finally learn to code. And that opened up a whole new world of skills for me, new ways to communicate. It's pretty cool when you can use a tool like Data Wrapper or a library like Flourish to make something that looks pretty good pretty quickly. And there are loads of beginner-friendly tools out there that let you visualize a data set without having to know R, Python, or JavaScript. And if you want to learn R or Python or JavaScript, there's tons of communities out there to help you do that. That's all really exciting, but it can also be a bit overwhelming. Like, with all these tools, where do I start? If I want my work to be more than just pretty good, do I have to learn everything? Or should I just give up and stick to what I've always done? What I found frustrating is feeling like there's a limit to what you can do without specializing. It can feel like, what's the point when a professional developer or data scientist could do a better job? But I think the most important thing that I learned from coding was this programmatic mentality, to see how everything, no matter how complex, is made up of smaller, simpler components. And I translated that to my work as a writer. I started to think about story as being made up of more basic components. I could see these lower level elements working together the same way a programmer might see a function. And that's what makes me optimistic. I do believe a lot of us have something to contribute to creating storytelling projects, even if you're not a developer and more of a jack of all trades like me. It's not everybody's destiny to be a full-on techie, and that's okay. Probably the techies shouldn't have all that power and responsibility anyway, and maybe they have something creative to offer instead of just being handed something and told, here, make this. My guiding question is, how do we reduce the gap in language with developer speak? And how to develop a shared vocabulary so we can talk about crafting story moments? And is it possible to bring more people to the table, more voices in producing the work that we do? This presentation is about my efforts to answer some of those questions. I believe that collaborating across disciplines has the potential to produce powerful work that reaches more people. I've been documenting these elements of what I call story moments in a project of mine called the Encyclopedia of Storytelling. But before I get into it, I want to share with you a little bit of my philosophy. So we all have different fields of expertise and different languages we speak. And what I'm looking at is how, even though we use different tools, we all follow a kind of universal language of story. The basic ethos behind this project is that whether you're a journalist, a designer, a data analyst, someone who works with social media or video, maybe in research or advocacy or communications, we're all storytellers. Visualizing data is always about telling a story. And of course, you can see all kinds of amazing things being done with data storytelling today. Like, how would we even begin to wrap our heads around something like a coronavirus pandemic or an election without charts and maps and numbers? But there are some caveats to my optimism about the power and ubiquity of data storytelling. I hear people say, why pour resources into this big multimedia project when there's no guarantee it'll be worth the investment? And I can see this disparity also in my field. The New York Times or the Washington Post may have the resources to do absolutely groundbreaking work with 3D forensic crime scene reconstruction and charts no one's ever seen before, but not everybody has the capability to do that work. High caliber work is expensive because developer time is expensive. That investment in something really carefully crafted is more of a risk when there's all this other content on the internet that's competing for people's time and attention. And with the world falling apart around us, I mean, people sometimes want to escape and be entertained. But for those of us who want to put something out into the world that we feel matters, that we feel people need to know about, that's worthy of their attention, I think we've got to find a way to stick to our values while still claiming a space to be heard in the attention economy. As creative storytellers working in the public interest, which I'm sure is all of us because we're here attending Outlier, our challenge is to find a way to use facts to entertain. But then there's this issue of too much of a good thing. Like immersive multimedia interactives were really impressive and impactful when they were the avant-garde. But now it's like, okay, we've seen it. There's lots of this quantity, but not always the same quality. And we all know what it looks like when something cool gets overused. It's like, reminds me of corny music videos. Like, why are they doing the vertigo effect? And like, why is there all this zooming? And why slow motion there? Like, well, just because you could use a visual technique doesn't mean you should. We can laugh about this, but it's actually a serious issue. The same overuse of empty visual techniques that makes pop culture utterly forgettable is the same thing that gives people fatigue when they see it in the news. Maybe that works in a medium that's meant to entertain or visually stimulate, but when you're trying to throw facts at someone and there's no underlying story there, people will get disinterested and they tune out. This is bad for us because we miss an opportunity to reach people. Our bosses are going to be less willing to take a chance on doing an ambitious project because they'll say the accountants say it's not worth it, and then we're basically letting what's trendy decide what we create. Should we just scrap the idea of carefully explaining complex issues and stick to the short, snappy stuff? Should we give in to the idea that audiences are stupid with short attention spans and they're not going to pay attention to anything with nuance? I disagree. I think audiences are smart, and we should be treating them that way because they know what they want, and if we're not reaching them, it's us who've got to reconfigure and get creative. I also dispute that doing really incredible work has to be only the privilege of only those with a big budget, because behind every digital experience on every screen is a story. I think we can do a lot with a little, and the secret ingredient is to collaborate. In order to collaborate, when we all have different disciplines and speak different languages, the first thing to do is to get on the same page. And getting on the same page is exactly what I'm trying to do with the Encyclopedia of Storytelling. My goal is to develop a shared vocabulary that allows people of different disciplines who speak different languages to better talk about the tools and techniques that we use to tell stories on the web. What do I mean by that? One way to see a story is simply a series of events or facts. You could present these events using a timeline, for example. A timeline is basically a storytelling device made from structured data governed by the principle of time progressing in a linear way. The viewer is able to process the relationship between those events progressing in a line in time. We shouldn't take for granted all the psychology that's going on there. People intuitively understand that one thing comes after another from the visual cues that they're receiving. If we look closer at that psychology, we can see that a structured series of events isn't the only thing going on in a story. We can see moments of story in architecture and performance, the same way you can see a narrative arc going through a 7-course tasting menu, from the appetizers to the main course to dessert. And these are concepts that you can apply in storytelling, whether you work in creating media or you're just pitching an idea to coworkers. This might sound a little abstract. The form in which data is delivered is also a key to understanding that data. So what if the data that you want to convey is a feeling? Music has the ability to communicate feelings without needing to use words. And yet, music is really mathematical. Just look up harmonic series. So even though something might seem really artistic, it's actually still quantifiable. You could say that the base ingredients of music are rhythm, melody, and harmony. Rhythm being the regularity or irregularity between elements, determined by the space between them. Melody is the single voice that stands out in the foreground, and harmony is just the counterpoint or juxtaposition of multiple voices. Voices is actually the proper musical term for notes in a composition assigned to the same instrument. But with just a little stretch of the imagination, we can think about voices representing elements in a story or characters. Melody is the main character that stands out and guides a listener through an experience. It guides the audience's attention the way a camera guides us through a sequence of images from one thing to the next, to motivate toward moments where information is delivered. That could be the key statistic, the number, the figure, the disparity between two figures, the central critical fact that's important in hitting your viewer and making them realize, this matters, this is important to me, I relate to this. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do with storytelling. When I'm writing a long-form narrative or essay, I'm always thinking about melody, rhythm, and harmony. I think about the balance of how much different characters are appearing, how much weight they have, what's the rhythm of the interplay between them. I think about when's the right time to bring in harmonizing elements, to bring in relevant context that informs the reader and provides them with some insight about how what's going on with this individual person connects to a larger trend. And I think of melody as the main idea that I want the reader to come away with. Immersion is another word that gets talked about a lot, and when I hear it, of course I think about things like augmented reality, but I also think about architecture. Architecture naturally has this quality of immersiveness. It literally surrounds you. If you're in a grand cathedral, a citadel, a mosque, a museum, they all harness this art of creating moments in space. As you walk through an entryway into a passage that opens up into this grand moment where you feel yourself just enveloped by its massiveness. That's why when we describe a multimedia piece as immersive, it's usually because it uses some imagery that evokes the perspective of being inside an environment. These are the kinds of moments that I'm really fascinated by because they represent universal feelings in human experience. And this universal language transcends art forms from performance all the way to the internet. When you combine elements of music and architecture, you get theater, a performance that takes place in real time and space. Add to that a screen and you get cinema. Make that a digital screen and you get video. And when you add to that the internet, a web browser, JavaScript, you get every experience that you can find in cyberspace, which is all around us. Or maybe we're all around it because it's inside our minds because we're in the metaverse. The web also has its own vocabulary. It's scroll functions and databases and D3 and small multiples and photogrammetry. And there's this whole ocean of technical vocabulary that might be familiar to you or not, same as might be familiar or not when someone is talking about storyboarding or inverted pyramid or anecdotal lead. And this is where the encyclopedia comes in. It's meant to be something pragmatic, to bridge the gap between these different languages we speak when we're talking about story, and starting from a shared vocabulary, one that borrows from the fundamentals of different disciplines, and focuses on how do we use these tools to fuel story moments that are grounded in feeling and psychology. This feeling when a curtain comes up, or a surprise is introduced, or the way motion or light draws the eye to a subject, when the precise way that two things are placed or they're scaled says something about their relationship to one another, the way that elements are intertwined and revisited and tap into your recollection during the duration of a performance to make connections in your mind. These are story moments that are more primary than just exposition, rising action, climax, finale. They're more basic elements that make those up. You can think of them of sort of like a periodic table of elements for a story that direct the audience's attention for the purpose of building, sustaining curiosity, suspense, and catharsis. And catharsis, by the way, the payoff, is what Aristotle called the point of any good story. So, enough philosophy. Let's look at some examples. Number 1, motion. Let's look at this piece from the Washington Post. So the goal of this piece is obviously to use science to inform people about how COVID-19 spreads and how effective social distancing can be at stopping the viral spread. Easier said than done, but if we remember the principle of show, not tell, we can explain it. So this piece is actually very simple. It was actually from pretty early on in the pandemic, March 2020, when we were just realizing the danger of seeing this viral spike in cases on a daily basis, and that exponential curve needed to be flattened. So this piece involves a simulation that looks at how the virus spreads from one person to another. And it uses these simple dots that change color as they move from one to the next and touch the next dot to represent a state change as a person becoming infected. So now when we get to this more complicated diagram, we see the same thing happening on a larger scale, with all these dots moving around. Using the basic visual cues that we've already shown the reader, they understand what's going on. And in this last diagram, all these dots are motionless, representing social distancing, less movement around, less contact with the other dots. So it's almost too simple to explain. The reader understands all these things going on intuitively. Number 2, rhythm. This story takes the same topic, but takes a very different approach to informing about the seriousness of COVID-19. Takes a much more emotional approach. This single note is really reminiscent of a term that comes from classical music notation called sforzando, and it refers to an intense, sudden attack followed by silence, hitting you right in the face immediately with this powerful sentence there. And as the piece continues, it sets this steady rhythm, one piece of information at a time. There is some data reporting, but it's actually, I think the photographs are doing most of the talking, giving the emotional punch and rhythm to the story. Number 3, immersion. This piece uses immersion to take you inside the cockpit of a Boeing 737 MAX flight that unfortunately crashed off the coast of Indonesia in 2018. I think this piece is a great example of immersion because it doesn't just look cool, but it's specifically for the purpose of trying to explain a complex issue. And this piece came at a time when there were a lot of concerns about those planes because a number of them had had these in-flight emergencies and some had crashed. And this was a genuine issue of public concern and for the airline industry. And people really wanted to know what exactly were these technical malfunctions and was Boeing going to properly fix them and could they be trusted and could you fly without worrying? So what's really going on here? This is some classic scrollytelling, some 3D modeling. What I think is interesting is how they are connecting this real-time data to actual data from the plane, from the black box, and simulating how it was feeling on the plane. Number 4, expectations. Every magician knows expectations are really fun to play with, and people actually have expectations about how websites usually behave. And when you subvert this in a calculated way, it can be fun. So, in its essence, this piece, another one from the New York Times, is basically just a listicle. It's just a list of content that's looking at African American artists who are shaping culture today. But what sets it apart is this fun horizontal scroll that sets it apart by scrolling from left to right as you go through these different things and these fun elements come into the view. And it just wouldn't be as interesting with a vertical scroll. Number 5, scale. So in this piece by Reuters Graphics, scale is not just the technique used, but it's actually the message that they're trying to convey here, the scale of the exodus of Rohingya. So as you scroll through the piece, obviously the scale of this forced migration becomes more and more apparent. But what's also interesting going on is how they're actually controlling the pace of speed at which information is delivered and making sure every moment hits. You can't just slingshot your scroll through the piece and pass everything. They actually want you to absorb every moment as it hits. So it's actually making sure you don't miss anything by kind of controlling the pace of the melody. Number 6, choice. Choice is a really intriguing way to get audiences thinking about different divergent possibilities in a story. And this piece by CBC Radio Canada, it won a ton of awards actually. It's about self-driving cars and illustrating the trolley problem, which is a thought experiment that asks you if you would intentionally kill one person if you knew that it would save many more. So this is an issue that we're actually asking machines to make with self-driving cars. And it's demonstrating this problem by doing it in an experiential way. We know from psychology our brains learn better by doing. So by actually making the user make this choice in a kind of game-like way, this issue becomes much more real for you. Number 7, recapitulation. So recapitulation is another term from music that describes the moment in a sonata form when the development or diverging themes of the beginning parts come to an end and we start moving toward the finale. Or in other words, it's the moment when things start to wrap up. Fun fact, scholars of Beethoven have studied his Fifth Symphony and found that the recapitulation starts at exactly 61.8% of the way through, which is the golden ratio. I'm going to start to wrap things up with one last example, just for fun. Let's take everything we've covered about visual vocabulary and see how much can we understand from a piece without the benefit of understanding any of the words, just from what's going on visually. This piece by Tass is all in Russian, and so from the very first frame, we just have these 2 numbers and these 5 guys here, and we don't know anything else. We can kind of get a hint that we're meant to scroll down because there's this swoosh implying that there's something more below. Here's a painting, and I don't know, what are we supposed to be looking at? How can we guide the viewer? What it does with these arrows, they're guiding through these annotations and using a highlight, kind of like a spotlight, to show the reader that this is what you should be looking at, and here's some notes about it too. I hope this presentation has given you some insight into creatively using visual communication and psychology to tell better stories. Even if your work focuses on the data side, remember, data are only there to tell stories to humans. You're not a robot. You can be creative and artistic even. I hope that getting a grasp on this common language might help you to start doing that, thinking about intention when you pick up any tool in your toolbox, and maybe expanding that toolbox with some tricks from different fields or discipline. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this presentation as much as I did preparing it, and I really look forward to the discussion and all the discussions here at the rest of Outlier Conference.